Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of How Not to Plan 2025. So I'm going to talk about conditioning here. And I have to say that this transmission really worked me. I thought it was going to be really easy to record because this past holiday season, this was kind of the main theme that I was working with. And when this theme came through, I was like, okay, I think I know exactly how to talk about them. And this past week has just been one initiation after another for me to really see the subtle nuances of this specific medicine that wants to come through. So I hope you take some time to openly receive this. To me, this one is quite deep and it's also quite nuanced and complex. So my suggestion for how not to plan 2025 is to stop fighting your conditioning. What is, let's define conditioning for a second. Essentially, to me, our conditionings are patterns of thinking, being, feeling, or interacting that we learn, perhaps unconsciously, from our ancestors, from the cultures we live in, from our upbringing, and from our past experiences. And these patterns of being have helped us, for better or for worse, create the life that we create now. And as we're thinking about the coming year, for a lot of us, we become aware of the different ways that these patterns are not helpful for us anymore, or that we need to tweak them or transform them in some way in order to help us get to where we want to go. We all have conditionings, we all have patterns that keep us stuck in a loop, that keep us continuing to not be able to move forward from the places that we're in. And so much of New Year resolution culture revolves around fixing or escaping these patterns. So much of the self-help industry orients around this desire to fix the pattern. And in my experience, fixing our conditioning never works. This is not how one is to work with their conditioning. Instead, my invitation is for us to start contemplating what it means to transform our conditioning instead. Now, what is the difference between fixing our conditioning and transforming our conditioning? To me, fixing has this energy of has this connotation of stopping the energy, right? Stopping the underlying energetic flow. When we think about our conditioning, there is an energy that underlies that conditioning, right? And that energy is what keeps the conditioning moving. And when we try to fix it, what we often try to do is using our resistance or kind of the power of our grit, we try to stop the energy from flowing, right? We're saying, I don't want to do anymore, right? Like that's kind of the energy behind it. When we think about fixing, we're trying to will our way into ensuring that that conditioning is no longer part of our personality, is no longer part of how we live our lives. And we all know what happens with energy, right? Energy flows. Energy flows, energy can't be destroyed. It can only be shifted or transformed, right? And so this act of trying to fix things is rooted in resistance. And when we do something rooted in resistance, it often ends up creating this effect of, instead of the conditioning or the pattern actually starting to unravel, starting to diffuse, and starting to lead us to a new thing, what happens is it just ends up showing somewhere else in our lives, right? It becomes this game of whack-a-mole, essentially. Instead, what I'm proposing is we get curious about our conditioning, about the patterns that keep us stuck. And through that curiosity, we learn to orient towards that conditioning with a little bit more nuance. We understand more about where they're coming from, why they are the way they are, and we have spaciousness within ourselves to notice when we are moving from that conditioning in a way that actually doesn't really serve us, right? Or doesn't help us get to where we want to go. And so when I sat to review my projects, my goals, my resolutions from the past few years, what I noticed was this pattern of where paradoxically I continued looping when I harbor some resistance, right? Where I felt like I had to fight or fix my patterns are places where I continue to get stuck. So here's a contemplation that I found to be helpful in working with this, right? What if our conditioning is neither good nor bad? What if our conditioning is just neutral? What if our conditioning just is? We know that resistance is present when we find it difficult for us to interact from the lens of something being neither good nor bad, something simply being a thing we need to work with, right? A thing we need to dance with, and maybe we need to take leadership around. It doesn't mean that we have to like these patterns, right? The act of transforming the patterns is not a call for us to continue abusing ourselves or continue being abused, right? The call to transform our conditioning has to do with releasing a lot of the judgments that we hold around the conditioning, and releasing, therefore, some of the projects and some of the resolutions, some of the goals that we have that are really rooted in trying to fix ourselves. This is easy to see on a conceptual level, but when it actually shows up in our lives, it can be extremely challenging for us to be able to spot these patterns of trying to fix things, right? In my life, I've seen, for example, I have a really fraught relationship with my own inner critic. And something that I found that doesn't work is I can't just tell my inner critic to shut up. In fact, I need to make space for my inner critic to really talk to me. And there's something so powerful that happens when we actually create space for our conditioning to tell us their objections, to tell us what they're worried about, to really listen to our fear, right? I think it was Yumi Sakugawa who, a few years ago, I was obsessed with this idea that she mentioned about having tea with your demons, right? And I'm not saying that our conditionings are demons either. Sometimes it can feel like they're demons. But in reality, I think our conditionings are more like our ancestors, right? If we think about ancestors as being that which came before us, one way to think about our conditioning is that these are patterns who have allowed us to become who we are today, who have allowed us to arrive in the place that we are at today, right? Frankly, without our conditioning, we would not get to a place where we have enough safety internally and externally, where we have enough of a sense of self-esteem to be able to see that the conditioning is no longer working. You see what I mean? So there's something kind of tricky about this, right? We can't really work with our conditioning by hating them. We can't work with our conditioning by trying to pray them away. That our conditioning needs to be honored. They need to be given thanks, essentially. They need to be acknowledged, right? So that they can soften. And in allowing them to soften, we start to see, oh, there's not just one path to do things. Yes, I've been doing it a certain way, doing it in a way that makes sense to my conditioning, but I don't have to perpetuate this pattern, right? I can move to a different place. What I've learned is that we can't really build the future if we don't learn to see the past clearly. The past creates the present, and the present creates the future. If you want to see your past clearly, you need to begin by getting curious about them, tending to the big feelings that come up around them, and then, yes, hopefully at some point, you come to a sense of acceptance or love, even. We can't transmute our patterns of conditioning if we continue to hate them, because hating itself is a form of resistance. So I invite you to look at your goals, your resolutions, the things that you want to happen in 2025, and start being really honest with yourself. Which ones are there because on some deep level you're trying to fix what you consciously or unconsciously believe is irreparably broken about you. And I want you to really give that place a lot of love and a lot of witnessing. And in loving and witnessing, something may transform. Sometimes those goals no longer matter. Sometimes you start to have clarity about what actually matters to you. And this, to me, is where we start to move the needle forward. By really coming to a place where we're truthful with ourselves, where we're not trying to fix ourselves or stop the underlying life force that moves within us. All right, that's it. I'm really curious to hear what you think. If you want to share in a comment, if you are listening on Spotify, or if you want to write a review or share this episode on social media, I would love to hear what you think. All right, see you in part 3.